Hello, this is Moshe Shulman again. This is going to be my second talk, but it's really the first one in the series where I'm really going to get into some information about Judaism and what Judaism believes about things that relate to what the missionaries are trying to say. This specific talk is going to be about the Tenach, the Jewish Bible, and what it is and why do we have the books that we have. Some people have sort of the impression that the Bible was faxed down to us as one whole, and of course that's not really what the case is. The Bible came to us over a period of time. There was the Torah and then historical books and otherwise. So we really need to understand what it's about. In order to really understand this, and really I believe is what is the source of a considerable amount of differences between Judaism and its interpretations and Christianity and their interpretations, is we have to understand that there's a perspective towards the Jewish Bible, the Tenach, that Jews have that Christians don't have. And the way I usually bring this out is, especially when I'm talking to non-Jews, I ask them, what do you think about Abraham? Abraham in the Bible, book of Genesis. Usually I hear things like a man of great faith, a servant of God, something of that nature. And so I tell them, you know what I think? I think Grandpa, because I am a Levite, which means that I descend from father to son to Levi, who was the son of Jacob, was son of Isaac, who was son of Abraham. Abraham, I'm a direct descendant from father to son, over many generations back to Abraham. So when I read in Genesis about Abraham, it's not somebody who was a spiritual leader like the Pope or the Dalai Lama or somebody like that. I'm looking at somebody who is my ancestor. And there are other ancestors also of mine that you'll find in the Tenach. For example, we have an ancestry back, my wife's side, that goes back to Rashi. And Rashi was the 34th generation back to a rabbi called Rabbi Yochanan Sandler. And he was the 4th generation back to Rabbi Gamliel, who was the great-grandson of Hillel, who most Christians know who Hillel was. And Hillel was a great descendant from King David. And King David obviously goes back. Another descendant that we have is going back to Rabbi Shimshon of Kamenetz, who was the brother of the Maharam of Prague. And they're descendant from a rabbi in the early 11th century named Reb Hai Gaon. And his father, Shrir Gaon, wrote a work in which he talks about his ancestry, tracing it all the way back through the heads of the exile under the Persians, who were the hereditary kings, going back all through the whole house of King David, all the way back that way. So when I pick up a Tanakh, what I'm really seeing is my family history, whether it's Isaiah, whether it's the kings of Judah, these are people who are relatives of mine. Where a Christian doesn't see it that way. You see, Christian, when you go to your Bible class on Sunday and they start talking about Luke or somebody like that, you won't hear a little boy in the back of the class say, oh, that's my uncle, that's my grandfather. You don't hear that. So, however they feel, the reverence they feel to the New Testament, they don't have that personal relationship that a Jew has for the Tanakh. Okay? I'll give another example. My great-grandmother's father was a Kohen, a priest, meaning he was descended directly from father to son from Aharon, the brother of Moses, Moshe. So, whenever I read in the Torah about Moses, that's my uncle. Nobody is talking about in your Bible classes, you won't say anybody talking about, oh, you know, my uncle was Jesus, or my uncle was Paul, or my grandfather. It's not. So when we pick it up for a Jew who reads it, we have a personal relationship because these are our family. It's not like we pick up a book like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, which have many interesting things in it, maybe lessons to be learned or whatever. And it's something that has a direct link to us. And this plays itself out in the way the Jewish commentaries look at the text as opposed to Christian commentaries. For example, there's a very simple story there. Joseph being sold into Egypt by his brothers. Very simple story. Now, I'm aware that Christians have all kinds of allegorical things, foreshadowing all kinds of things about Jesus, whatever. But really, the story is very simple. There was a king in the First Temple period called Ahab, and his children married into the royal house of Judah, and so all the royal house of Judah from that time on were actually from his descendants. Ahab was from the tribe of Joseph. Now that means when I look at the story of Joseph being sold from his brothers, I have one grandfather, Joseph, being sold by at least two other ones, Judah and Levi, into exile. Here I'm looking for me, it's a family fight between my grandparents. One is fighting with the other, they have disagreement, ending up selling Joseph into Egypt. There's also obviously another thing, is that the story of Joseph is there for a specific reason why. My ancestors were in Egypt. They went out of Egypt. They received the Torah. They received God's law. They communicated directly with God. That was my ancestors. The whole Torah is about that. So the story of Joseph has a very simple meaning, an important thing. That tells us how it was that our ancestors got into Egypt. God worked it out in some way that the brothers should have a disagreement, selling Joseph into Egypt. Joseph going to Egypt was able to bring all of his brothers, and the Jewish people were able to be there, which eventually led to the Jewish people going out of Egypt, which eventually led to the giving of the Torah. That's why that story is there. But the Christians, because they don't relate to it as a family thing, as your relatives, they can't see it this way. And so instead of looking at the simple meaning, they have to give other kinds of meanings that relate to things that are totally outside of what God intended, or what's intended there. Now, what's interesting that I'd like to talk about now is, why do we have the books that we have? Why do we have what we have? Why don't we have other things? For example, we have many prophetic books, but not that many. There's basically 15 of them that we have of prophetic books, Isaiah, Zechariah, these kinds of books. But, for example, we know there was a prophet, Samuel. We don't have any of his prophecies. There was a prophet, Nusan, in the time of King David. We don't have his. Elijah the prophet. We didn't have Elisha. We don't have his. We have some historical stories, which relates to my ancestors, what was going on there, important events that we needed to know that God wanted. But we don't have any. So why do we have these and not other ones? And the reason is really simple. When the Jewish people were in exile in Babylonia, we had the Torah, of course, but the other books, which ones were added, were based on what it was necessary for us to know, which had lessons for us that we needed to know. So, for example, Elijah, what we know about from the book of Kings is sufficient. Other things that he said or did are not necessary for us to know. Isaiah, we have a book of Isaiah. We don't have all the prophecies. Isaiah probably had many other prophecies, things he said. We have those which are necessary to know for us. Likewise, the stories in the Torah that we have, or otherwise, we have very little about the lives of anybody. We just have certain events. Each of these events is trying to teach us and show us something. If you look at the Jewish commentaries, they try and explain what it's all about. In my next talk, I'm going to talk actually about how we know what verses mean, but the Jewish commentaries are specifically looking at what it means, because there are ancestors. There's a certain reasons, there's certain things that happen. We want to know what happened. It doesn't foreshadow anything else. These are things that happen. Of course, the laws in the Torah and different events that occurred, these are all important to the Jewish people. So what we have is not the whole story of what happened. What we have there is what it's necessary for us to know about. What we have a lesson that we can learn. So, for example, the one that I like to show the most is in the beginning of the book of Isaiah. It talks about how the people at that time would bring sacrifices, but they lived very unrighteous lives. They would steal from the poor and do things like that. So why do we have that? It's not talking about us. I'm not stealing from the poor. I'm not bringing sacrifices in unrighteousness. What it's trying to teach us is that, listen, look at the hypocrisy that was going on then. Learn from that. God is displeased with hypocrisy. You today, or me today, when I look at it, I see one thing. I see it telling us, God doesn't like hypocrisy. Don't be a hypocrite. That's what Isaiah is trying to teach us. And that's why we have that specific prophecy from Isaiah, to teach us not to be hypocritical. So again, what is the Tenach? The Tenach is my family history. And if you're Jewish, it's your family history. It's really about where you came from, the history of your ancestors. And why do we have these books? We have these books because they have lessons for us. Either the Torah because of its laws, or the stories because of the lessons they teach, or showing what happened, or other prophetic works which teach very important lessons for us to know. In every case, it's things that is necessary for us to know now. Hope you enjoyed this, and if you do have any questions, you can send them to projectttorah@gmail.com, and I will be collecting questions, and I will, at some time in the future, answer each and every one of them, at least those that are not answered in another one of my talks. So thank you and have a good evening.